Good evening. I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center, along with Dr. Ed Nersessian, who is now in France, where, if you've noted on our site, there is a Philoctetes Center of France. And you can read the proceedings of the Philoctetes Center of France in French on our website at the present time. The Philoctetes Center began as a discussion about imagination. Imagination being the palette of psychoanalysis, we were interested in what creative people who have particular access to the imaginative life could tell us about analysis, and conversely, what analysis could reveal about the process of creativity. Welcome to Imagining Utopia. I am now pleased to introduce Anne Cattaneo, who's sitting right over there. I first met Anne when we were both students in the doctoral program in dramatic criticism at the Yale School of Drama. While I turned most of my critical inclinations on my family, Anne went on to become dramaturg of the Lincoln Center Theater and creator and head of the Lincoln Center Theater Directors Lab. A three-term past president of Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas, she is recipient of LMDA's first Lessing Award for Lifetime Achievement in Dramaturgy. Anne will moderate tonight's panel and introduce the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. The part that I'm least good at is introducing other people. So you're all carrying a program. I'll introduce everyone by just saying who they are, and you can read exactly. They all have enormous biographies that we can only begin to touch on. Adrienne Baxter Bell is, this is a discussion that's going to encompass many facets, but comes to us to talk in particular about the world of art. Teaches at Marymount, welcome. Sitting next to me, obviously you know Peter Gay, is emeritus professor from Yale, author of many, many books. So I'm sort of counting on you to hold up the 19th century part of this, and as well as many other things. Robert Pippin, sitting on my right, is from Chicago. Represents the world of philosophy on our panel. John Rockwell, who's an old friend from Lincoln Center. What are you here for? Art, literature, and art, literature, marriage, and music, I think. Former editor of the Arts and Leisure section, just published a book. And Edwin Schlossberg, who I'm delighted to welcome. I see you as the 21st century architecture, cyberspace, and media. And all of their various books and accomplishments are on your program. This panel actually began thanks to Starbucks, because Francis and I were getting together after not seeing each other for a number of years when we first went into rehearsal with Coast of Utopia. I edit with John Guare, the playwright, the magazine that we just passed out to all of you, the Lincoln Center Theater Review, which is a magazine that's sort of an armchair companion to many of the plays. We do it 3 times a year. We view it as an ideal theater-going companion. If you've just seen Utopia and you wonder what Margaret Atwood might have to say about Utopia, you can open your magazine and there she is discussing Utopia. And John and I had just interviewed her, and I was so excited by what she had to say, and then I went to have a cup of coffee with Frank, and we talked a lot about this interview, and Frank said, you should come up and do a panel about that. So we went into rehearsal with this absolutely insane project, a 3-part trilogy on 19th century Russian utopian thinkers. We thought we were going to be in a deficit situation, nobody would be interested in this. The first day we put our member tickets on sale. I came to work at 10 in the morning, and I thought that the library for the performing arts had been evacuated. There was a line of 3,000 people going up Amsterdam Avenue waiting to buy tickets. So clearly the subject of Utopia is one that seems resonant and interesting to many, many people. And it has gone on to be very, very widely embraced by audiences, by the press, etc. And as a result of that, I think it's a pleasure to be here now. We're just about to open the final part. I've been in rehearsal all day. I saw Stoppard when I was leaving, who is got a lot of work to do tonight, and he said, "Oh, I'd much rather come to your panel than have to go to work tonight." So he asked me to say hello to everybody. Some of you have seen these plays. Some of you have not. They present, they're plays which have many ideas about living together in the world. but they follow the story of friends who met at the University of Moscow in the 1840s, a generation of the 1840s. And as young students, they formed into political circles and philosophical circles and began to agitate, write, and reform for change in Russia. The emancipation of the serfs, some freedom to travel, freedom of the press, and bringing in new ideas from the West, ideas of philosophy, of course, and political thinking. They all were jailed, sent into exile, and they reunited in the second play in Paris in 1848. The characters, obviously, many of you know, are Alexander Herzen, Michael Bakunin, Nicholas Agariev, who was a friend of Herzen's and a poet, Vissarion Belinsky, who's a literary critic and really responsible for nurturing many of the early writers, Russian writers of this century, not Pushkin, but pretty much everybody after that, and who am I forgetting? Stankiewicz, who's the head of the philosophy circle. Stankiewicz and Belinsky die quite young. And we follow those who, and of course Turgenev, Ivan Turgenev, who was also a student at that time. They were all in the same class at the University of Moscow, just like you and I were. So we follow them at the Moscow University. So we follow them in the three plays to Paris in the second play, where they are there, as in fact, everything's true, everything's based on historical fact. They were all there during the Revolution of 1848, and in the, except for Belinsky and Stankiewicz, who have died of tuberculosis by then. And then we continue to follow them in the third play into their exile in England, and towards the very end, we are in Geneva when Herzen died, right before Herzen's death. So this panorama of a century opens up, you know, in Stoppard's view, questions of all kinds: how to live together, how to live in the world, how you imagine a future, should one imagine a future, and how. So with that in mind, I emailed around a few questions. As I said, this is a conversation that we will start among ourselves and then open to questions from you. It's a conversation we could be probably having for the next 3 weeks, but we'll open up a few things to talk about today. So I sent around some questions, and I'm going to just, mention some of those, and from our different areas of observation and expertise. I'd just like to ask you all if you would respond as you see fit as we get started. The first question I circulated to our panel was: Is utopian thinking a product of certain historical times? Why was the 19th century such a fertile time for this kind of thinking? Margaret Atwood, in her interview, when I was seeing Frank, had just said that the utopian thinkers seemed to be focused in the 19th century, whether they're the Shakers, whether they're the thinkers in our play Coast of Utopia. And in contrast, the utopian thinkers of the 20th century are Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pot Paul, and I added the Reverend Jim Jones. So is there something about the kind of thinking that's different in those centuries? And then I became curious, and Frank and I talked a little bit about this, about the utopian thinkers now, the 21st century. Sim City, Second Life. Is there utopian thinking going on the web among young people? There's some urge for it. And why does it pop up, and how does it pop up in different centuries? So maybe I'll open that out as my first question and see if anybody has anything to say. 19th, 20th, or 21st. Would you like to start, since you're my 19th?
Why was there so much interest in utopias in the 19th century? Well, it's obviously very difficult to deal with, because there are many utopias earlier, as you know, and some 19th century utopianism is in a way borrowing from earlier utopians. So that might be one of the reasons. Another was the existence of an open, relatively open country like the United States, where games could be played that were not available in Europe, the so-called, as our vice president calls it, the old country or the old culture. So I don't think it's too surprising But there's perhaps one other thing, a certain loosening up of rather rigid notions of where people belong in a social hierarchy. Again, I don't want to overdo this, but I do think that, let's say, after 1815, after the end of Napoleon, there's a good deal of stirring about where people in fact belong. I mean, as a historian, I haven't liked the phrase rising bourgeoisie for a long time, but is something to this. There's, to say, entrepreneurship, where people like, well, American millionaires, for example, very often come from Europe and under very limited circumstances, and then can make it over here in a way they could not in Europe. So there may be, these are a couple of things occur to me.
Would you give us a little background on the philosophers of the 19th century who were mentioned in our play?
5 minutes or 10 minutes?
How about 5?
Well, one of the really interesting things, I know we're not assuming anyone has seen the plays, but as a way into this question, one of the really interesting things about the characters in this play is none of them are really, Bakunin probably the most sort of traditional utopian thinker, that is, people who just don't think that society could get better or even very much better, but who think it could be perfected. The classical notion of utopia has been Plato, More, experiments in social communal living in the 19th century and so forth. And anarchism, the struggle constantly against rule or order of any kind as a kind of perfected life, constantly perfecting itself. But the other forms of utopian thinking, which I think is a good phrase, that are alive in the play are much less traditional. I mean, Herzen's pretty much a moderate reformist in a certain sense. But the reception of philosophy, German philosophy of the 19th century, played such a huge role in the dialogue in the play, which I never had seen before in a public production of anything. Warms one's heart.
I had to spend a great deal of time in July trying to make our wonderful actor, David Harbour, who had just won a Tony and who's afraid of Virginia Woolf. May I say, he and no one else in the company had ever heard the name Hegel when we went into rehearsal, bringing them along to fictive shelling. So please go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is not only because it's good PR for what I make my living on, but it's good because the Russian reception of German philosophy sort of highlighted an aspect of that particular strain of idealism in which actually the advent of modernization, of modernity, Western European Enlightenment, modernity from its French through its German versions, represented for many of these people the advent of utopia itself already. That the ideals of the French Revolution, the social mobility introduced by new forms of wealth production, and essentially German romantic notions of a kind of vast cosmic scene on which all this was playing out, altered the way traditional utopianism is often presented, rather than as just some unattainable ideal we have to hope we can approximate. Many of them began to think it was actually happening, and with tremendous envy at Russian backwardness and inability to join in the realization of this ideal. The ideal was human liberty, that this seemed to be given in a very compressed way the sort of message of German idealism, that this was the point of everything, the point of all cosmic creation was the final realization of human liberty, which had started to occur. Tremendously exciting. But there are two other forms of utopian thinking in the plays that are extremely interesting. One is the enormous burden placed on art, that there's a kind of utopian domain accessible in aesthetic transcendence. That's extremely interesting. This idea would become so powerful. A way of transcending the ordinary, finite, contingent, unacceptable humdrumness of everyday life in aesthetic transformation is more of a burden that art could bear, but interesting that it came to bear it. And then, while all the men are reading Hegelian philosophy, all the women are reading George Sand. And that means that they also placed this enormous burden, a utopian burden, on romantic life, on the idealization of human love as something more than the messy coupling of animals, but this spiritual transcendence in a kind of ideal unity that would transform life by virtue of just having occurred. And these other forms of utopian thinking, romantic life, aesthetic transformation and this lust for modernity represented something rather non-traditional in utopian thinking, not the sort of perfected plan imitated just faintly by. That struck me as quite interesting in the play.
Yeah, and isn't that also Schelling's philosophy that you find transcendence in art?
Yes, very much. And there's a nice line in the play where one of the characters says, "Well, I prefer Fichte. He's at least more democratic. We can all have a share in it.
Yeah.
We don't
have to be a great artist."
Right.
Yeah. What about John? What about in music?
I would just say that Stoppard gets a lot of comic play about Bakunin rushing in about every 10 pages and says, forget Kant, the truth is in Fichte, forget Fichte, and every time he picks up a new German philosopher, he jettisons all the previous ones, which is amusing if you find them all kind of interesting. In music, music has always operated on its own sort of mystical plane, the music of the spheres and all of that, and so that's why Plato had attitude about it. But, so that you could argue that the community of notes is a utopian community all by itself, and musicians belong to a kind of elect society that can share in this that mere mortals cannot.
Well, I'm thinking even about Wagner.
Well, but there's no question that many of the romantics, not just Wagner, but also Liszt and Chopin and others, had a more or less articulated philosophy to go along with their composition that romantic music shared in many of these presuppositions having to do with not only a kind of transcendent betterment of man through aesthetics, but also the sexual romantic notion of it. To what extent all of these harmonized together in the way Stoppard conjoins them in this play, and to what extent they were all sort of parallel movements, I don't know, but certainly with Wagner, friend of both Bakunin and Herwegh, who plays a role in this, which you didn't mention him as a character, but Georg Herwegh, the German semi-revolutionary poet, they all believed both in political revolution and in aesthetic romantic revolution. And so it wasn't just George Sand who swept along the susceptible, but it was also the music of the time. Best rendered in it, the taboo perfume ad of the woman swooning backward as the diabolically handsome violinist embraces her.
It's funny, only people over 45 remember that ad.
Hey, that's everybody in this room. It's okay. Most everybody in this room.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because we had a conversation with Tom about that. When you look at Herzen's writings, it isn't only the women who were totally tuned into George Sand. She was enormously influential to the men in the play as well, to Herzen and Bakunin. They loved her, and of course she's having the affair with Chopin, and it's an absolutely astonishing period because everybody seems to be knowing everybody. Bakunin runs off to Saxony with Richard Wagner, and everybody's sort of in this world in Paris in 1848 when they come out to the West.
In fairness, Bakunin ran off to Saxony where he met Richard Wagner.
That's where he met.
He was less interested in Wagner maybe than Wagner was in him in terms of a thinker. Bakunin hardly knew or cared much about Wagner's music, regarded him as an amusing companion on the barricades, but,
And tell us your theory about
Which one? I have many theories. Well, it's not a theory. It's fairly known that the original character of Siegfried, now regarded in post-Nazi times as a kind of Aryan bully boy, the original character of Siegfried was based on Bakunin. And Wagner writes at considerable length in My Life, his autobiography, about Bakunin's character and what a force of nature he was and so forth.
So I had to make, thanks to John, some little recordings of Siegfried arias for Ethan Hawke to wear on his iPod when he was getting ready for the role. Could you talk a little bit about art in that century? There's a little bit of references in the play.
Romantic revolution. That's a great phrase. Something that certainly resonated with me when I was thinking about this, and I'm afraid I'm going to ricochet this over to America because it's such an important topic for Americans, of course, in the 19th century. And one of the things that I was thinking about when we were batting around this idea was the connection between utopia and nature, and how important nature, what an important role nature plays in really defining what utopia is to Americans of the 19th century. because it all begins, of course, with a kind of city on the hill. So the errand into the wilderness, the notion of conquering the wilderness, the Jeffersonian agrarian ideal. These are all profoundly utopian concepts. And during the 19th century, for the artists especially, there's a tremendous struggle to identify utopia and the wilderness. I was thinking about Thomas Cole, for example, who speaks in his Letters on Landscape Painting in 1836. He defines the wilderness as yet a fitting place to speak of God. I mean, no more utopian a phrase can you get than that, in a way. And but he's also somebody who anticipates the destruction of utopia. All we have to do is go to the New York Historical Society and see his Course of Empire series, for example, from 1836, and see the agrarian pastoral ideal, the rise of civilization, and the eventual destruction of civilization. So that's a whole sort of utopian arc from beginning to end. We see the progress of the creation of a utopia and the eventual destruction, which raises, of course, the point of whether or not there is the seed of destruction inherent in every potential utopia. So that's another thing that we can talk about. And of course, the 19th century itself is this incredible fruit basket of utopian ideas, both from the philosophical point of view and then manifested out in various concrete ways with these utopian societies, Brook Farm and Eagleswood, these various communities that had their rise and fall themselves. But they were essentially also so deeply connected to nature that they existed in nature, on nature. They were self-sustaining through nature. So nature is always, for me, a part of this idea. And before Darwin, before the Civil War, in fact, very much, I think, for me at least, a sense of a physical place. And then this transformation that takes place in mid-century with Darwin, with the idea of now nature as a killing field that for the first time we're seeing through photography with the photographs of Brady, yes, exactly, and Timothy O'Sullivan and so on. And all of a sudden people see nature associated with death and destruction and the dissemination of those images. And then, as I was thinking also about this community and the interest in psychology, it struck me how much utopia becomes a psychological state towards the end of the 19th century, and how there's this tremendous turn inward towards defining what psychology is, and the new understanding of consciousness in the writings of William James, for example, who uses the notion of nature and psychology together when he defines something like a stream of consciousness. So nature becomes something that is internalized and helps us to define very much who we are. And we see this very profoundly again in the works of artists of the late 19th century. We see people like George Innes and Blakelock and Ryder turning to their own internal states in order to create works of the landscape, but that are nowhere defined as the landscapes. And in a way, those are all utopian visions. They may have the name Montclair, New Jersey on them, but they are, in fact, a kind of utopic vision. And I was also reminded of a wonderful story about Ryder, for example, who notoriously lived in a complete mess on West 4th Street in a brownstone, and his house was filled with junk and boxes and old clothes and even food. And people would go in to see him and write about him and describe this mess, especially an enormous mess outside of his window in a garden with piles of junk and all this. And they wondered how in the world he could live in this kind of environment. And when he was asked about it, he described a utopic vision of flowers and birds singing and trees and all sorts of wonderful things. So very much for him, he was seeing a utopia, and it was very much his psychological state that utopia had become a personal internalized vision. So I guess I was interested in that trajectory to sort of get a handle on this enormous, monstrous topic. I was thinking about how in the 19th century there was this sort of inward moving process. And of course we also see it in the Manet painting, because it itself is such a problematic painting in terms of what is nature and how are we looking at nature. This shift in our vision is something that painting really embodies completely, and it's all done in a natural setting.
The painting is actually on the back of the magazines that we passed out to everybody. You're all familiar with it, and it's a painting that at a key moment in the second play you realize is suddenly on stage. in the Beaumont. Just to sort of stake out our boundaries moving into the present. And I sort of wondered if we could move to architecture too, which seems important. SimCity, where are we now? Cyberspace? Could you give us some thoughts to move us a little bit into the present?
One of the things that's one of the things that was so striking to me about the presentation, the expectation of anything about utopia suggests, the other than the real, that it has an idea of imagined composition outside of the real, where you can create perfection. And I think that one of the brilliant aspects of the staging of this play was the creation of an environment that where the sensibility of the perfection was sort of constantly being talked about but never realized. That in an interesting way, the utopian experience of those men's and women's lives was actually much more vital than the ideas that they were presenting as something fantastic. And one of the things that was interesting about the pieces that you collected, and then I went on, of course, like everyone else, and bought Isaiah Berlin and other people and read all about it, was that, if you think about what Russia was like, the number of people that could have actually contemplated a utopia or had that conversation was so small, and that there was actually no sort of rich cultural life, or a very small rich life. And so the idea of imagining something had to be abstracted. It had to be something that was not connected. And in the staging of the play, for those who haven't seen it, there are mannequins of the serfs all the way along the back edge of the thing, just standing there. And it's stunning that this play is all, that the disembodiedness of everyone who is not part of this conversation is, and in a sense, the portrayed insensitivity to that is essential for the idea of the composing of the stories. And to counterbalance that, the optimism of contemporary life with the idea of composing reality collaboratively rather than individualistically, the sort of pluralistic composition of reality is what we're involved in. I think that Stoppard is sort of tipping his hat to the fact that you can't really, that utopia is what's happening in the present, not this aspirational environment in the future, and that's what we have to reject this idea of it always being the city on the hill, that it actually has to be the city we're living in.
Have you seen the third play yet?
I haven't.
Okay, well, you're right with Mr. Stoppard. All you got to do is come to the very end, and you'll be very happy, because what you just said was...
I tried to go Tuesday night, but I just couldn't get there.
Yeah.
It was, you can tell that that's what it's about.
Yeah.
It is also the most brilliantly staged, I think, visual experience of a play I've seen maybe ever. As contextually to actually set the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a statistic when we first met over a year ago. The director Jack O'Brien and Bob Crowley and Scott Pask, our set designers, and we were just beginning to sort through this. It's an extremely complex read, this trilogy. I mean, you really have to focus hard. And so I was doing some research and came up with this actual statistic that the population of Russia at this time, 1840 or something, when the play begins, was 10% of the population was literate, and there were 50 million, 90% of the population were serfs. And if you look at the comparable statistics in the United States, I mean, Lincoln freed, I think, I can't remember the numbers now, I wrote it in my insert, like 6 million slaves or something. So, I mean, the emancipation of Alexander II freed 12 times as many serfs, but the percentage of Russia of people who were slaves was just completely different than in the United States, and thus came those mannequins in the back that they're always present because they were such a huge percentage of the population of Russia. Talk a little bit about SimCity. What do you think about that?
SimCity is an environment that the users create. It's an online, it started out as a single compositional environment that you could do on a computer to actually create a simulation of a city or a cell or a plant or an animal. And then eventually it got to be a much more complex environment. And now it's what's called a massive multiplayer environment where you have hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously living and working and composing a city together.
Does anybody here have kids who play SimCity? Yeah.
My students.
And Second Life, well, there are many, but Second Life is SimCity has a collaborative sense. Second Life basically is a narrative. It has a direction.
It's like asking who's Frank Sinatra. SimCity is one of the biggest selling computer games in America now, and everybody is on it, creating these little towns, how many people in the towns, and what's the industry, and I mean,
some of my students play this more radical one where you create a character for yourself, a completely different character
Second Life.
that goes through, and some of them become so involved in it they lose the original life they have.
Well, there is a conversation about being carbon life versus silica life. That people really feel that they don't know where they really prefer to live. So I think that's
carbon.
It's a very compelling experience for many people, and I think it's compelling is because it's a very thorough practice environment for real life, and there are very few of those.
Mm-hmm. That's so true.
But the key thing is, do you really die? Can you die in one of these games?
Well, we certainly can become a millionaire.
Yeah.
There's been the first millionaire who had earned money selling all the avatars and costuming and real estate that he had created in Second Life to other people.
But surely that's a secondary form of being a millionaire. The primary form being a virtual millionaire.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's currency in each one of these environments, which is the currency of the game, which people then trade. But some of them have traded out into the carbon world.
Degenerate renegades that they are.
The carbon.
On which side?
on the virtual side, which is the true reality.
Sounds like we're talking about 19th century idealism here.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so we've laid a few things out on the table. I'll move to my second question. These are not in any particular order. This has come up in some of our rehearsals. Why is utopian thinking in literature, and I wrote some examples, 1984, Handmaid's Tale, Brave New World, Animal Farm, so much more pessimistic than in political writing, if you agree with that subject?
Well, what would you categorize as political writing?
Well, I'm thinking maybe of these philosophers or the writing of Marx or the writing of Lenin. I mean, the writing that looks to make change in a positive way. In the arts.
Well, you had made a good differentiation between those two things.
Yeah, and it does depend on which period you're talking about. I mean, we're at the play cycle stops before the emergence of a kind of complete disaffection with modernist conceptions of utopia. I mean, 1848 is the big political break. But even in the play, there's a fine line by Herzen that we wanted modernity, but now it's just materialism, triviality, and skepticism, and that's not what we thought it was going to be. The same sort of thing is true about the romantic complications, that this idealization, people are, the freedom of free love, people are hurt, destroyed, devastated, disloyalties occur, betrayals. There isn't any such thing as that kind of freedom. And the sort of impotence of art to actually affect cultural or social change. We're right at the period where if you're now talking about dystopian political thought, you have to think about Nietzsche, Heidegger. The current changes fairly dramatically in late modernist culture, in European philosophy and cultural writing in general.
And what are those dates, like 1880s?
Well, say roughly from 1870 to the Second World War. There's this tremendous, and same thing is very obvious in art as well, dystopian element entering in, a kind of fatigue with the utopian expectations of modernism and modernity not being fulfilled. This revolutionary hope to be completely self-determining, because 19th century utopian thought is the most radical humanism in the history of modern thought, that it's all about us. And we're about to take over completely from nature even. We're going to make nature do our will, we're going to be completely self-determining collectively, and all of it turned out to be in some sense, a false expectation or an illusion. I mean, there are still thinkers around who think the problem is just completing modernity's promise, rather than this fundamental realization of its deceptive or false consciousness kind of aspect. But in much political or cultural or philosophical writing after the period after 1848, one might say, the same kind of dystopian tone that you're pointing to in literature becomes much more pronounced as well.
Yeah, actually I ran across this just saying to the actor playing the doctor on the seashore in the third play, who's going to become the central character of Fathers and Sons by Turgenev, all nihilists are children of idealists. So I thought it was kind of nice. And Tom is very aware of this generational shift, this generational change.
But did we therefore refute your premise?
I don't know. Or shall I?
In other words, the argument would seem to be that pessimism and optimism is a faction of place and time rather than form of expression.
Well, I'm wondering, I was trying to think of a contradiction to this list. You know, what is a optimistic utopian novel? Can anybody think of one?
Well, there are science fiction novels.
Yes, we have to go to science fiction, yes.
There are things like that are, but it's not clear what their actual topos, their place is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I don't know that much about science fiction, but science fiction obviously plays a huge role. I didn't even know which books to cite, but it plays a huge role in utopian thinking because that's a whole genre that's actually...
There's a lot of pessimistic science fiction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
But I mean, is a novel that sort of ends well, or where the family really gets along? Is that a utopian novel? I mean, is that an optimistic?
I'm trying to think of a novel where the family.
Well, there's a kind of parallel novel to this series of plays, and that's Roth's American Pastoral, which is a kind of novel about the 1960s, very much about the same sort of things that the reaction to 1848 was about. The novel is really about the failure, but also about the self-deceit, the naivete, the sort of cruelty that kind of self-deceit and naivete can visit on an entire civilization. But that just makes your point that there isn't...
But we live in a kind of anti-utopian climate, which in turn is a result of all your dictators that you reeled off earlier on. In other words, and I'm not sure that they represent 20th century utopian thinking so much as in the eyes of those who think that utopianism is inherently flawed, that they represent the kind of grim consequences of the working out of the ideas of the 19th century optimistic utopians. But there's a lot of, when you say literature is pessimistic and the political writing is optimistic, there's certainly a lot of pessimistic political writing, especially in the second half of the 20th century. So, as I say, place and time versus form of expression.
Any thoughts? Okay.
I'm thinking.
Okay, good. All right, I'll move on. I mean, I'm just trying to throw, a number of questions at her. Looking at the heydays of utopian thinking, do they coincide with times of social change, new trends in art or music, changes in marriage and personal relations? Thus, Stoppard's 1848, 1920s, 1960s. So I'm just wondering, looking at certain shifts.
Well, the utopians between 1815 and 1848 were living in a time of Metternichian repression, sort of post-Napoleonic conservative reaction. So in that sense, they would not correspond to times of social change. If anything, they engendered them.
Well, because not much happened. The famous 1848 turning point, which didn't turn.
Right.
I mean, if you look ahead by 1849, things are roughly as they've been. So I don't think...
Which these characters are very unhappy about.
Yes.
That the characters in Stoppard's play.
That's very similar to 1989. That same kind of euphoria and then disappointment to a certain extent. I mean, you could say, the horrors of the 20th century are well known, but post-89 is the first time since the French Revolution that there's not on the world stage a kind of revolutionary consciousness, a revolutionary movement of any kind.
Except Islam.
Well, if you call it a progressive revolutionary movement, in my political radical Islam doesn't seem to me to be. It's a regression, though. It's an anti-modernist.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, that's a very odd thing for modernity, because modernity itself is a revolutionary ideology. But the idea that the domestic virtues are so erotically unsatisfying, peace, commodious living, the bourgeois family, domestic life as a mode of life doesn't seem to be able to generate a kind of fervor or allegiance. I mean, it did when it was an anti-repressive movement, but so much of the literature and art of the, say, post-mid-19th century is full of a kind of bourgeois self-hatred.
CF, the generalized optimistic hysteria of August 1914. You know, when everybody was saying, finally we can get rid of all this boring peace and domesticity and go off and be heroic. Well,
they found out.
They got their chance.
Yes, and actually, just to go back to what you started with that sentence, I mean, Edwin actually in the interview mentions that out of this utopian thinking of the 19th century come a number of these movements. End of slavery, feminism, I mean, these are all sort of a logical progression.
Yeah, well, there's still a lot of liberation of ethnic politics, identity politics. There's still a lot of sort of liberationist rhetoric about finding new forms of repression to liberate oneself from. Mm-hmm. But one senses that has a short half-life as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And there's a reaction against all of that also, of course, which is the slide into aestheticism in the late 19th century. Mm-hmm. So that's a pure escapist fantasy in a way.
Well, it's not an escapist fantasy if you regard romantic, aesthetic, and political as more or less on the same plane. If you regard aesthetic as a sort of third-rate reflection of the realities of political life, then it's an escapist fantasy. But
well, it's escapist to the extent that I think that it wasn't grappling with the problems at hand as much as papering them over, in a way, literally, with beautiful things to look at. And certainly in America, I mean, the whole tonalist movement was something that was about beautiful women in beautiful costumes and beautiful settings. And
place a higher value on beauty than as an escape from the reality of politics.
It's not to say that it was any less, it's just different. I think that's, I'm not saying that it's any worse than that. I'm simply arguing that it was an option that had not been presented quite as forcefully before that time.
Okay, my next question was one that Francis liked a lot. Starting with the Bible, I always think of the Garden of Eden. And why is there so much nudity called for in utopias?
What, 19th century art?
19th century art? Anybody want to take? What was your response to that?
My response to it is it was precisely the issue that seemed to be that none of us had really dealt with in our preconceptions of the Roundtable. That the ideology of the Roundtable dealt with precisely aesthetic matters and matters of society and matters of philosophy. We really hadn't dealt with utopia as an intrapsychic issue. That is to say that an aspiration, and it sort of goes in a way German idealist element that, you know, that in Fichte and in Schelling, and certainly going back into Kant, you know, where you have the notion of the phenomena and noumena, and you separate that. The mind is conjuring up something which you can have synthetic a priori knowledge. In other words, you can have knowledge of the world that's not based upon any vision of the world, which suggests to me the notion that there's a utopian impulse that exists inside of human beings that is apart from any of the kind of the milieu in which the human being finds himself. In other words, that there may be some kind of Edenic or prelapsarian kind of desire for a return to a state that is devoid of temptation, of all the things that make us human in a strange and odd way, you know, of eros, of thanatos, of aggression, you know, all of the elements of the Edenic world. That was kind of what I was getting at, because we are, after all, a center for the study of imagination, and we are also neuroscientifically oriented and psychoanalytically oriented. So the response to the nudity was very kind of suggestive, and I didn't mean it to be in a puerile sense, although of course that's the sense in which I enjoyed it. And I have nothing against the eros either as a form of kind of utopian conception, but there really seems to be this instinct in people to create something that is almost a genetic, and it's almost an intrapsychic and almost an organic human propensity, and that was what that question meant to me.
And that was what was motivating all those ticket buyers to come at 10 in the morning and buy the tickets to Utopia. I mean, I included a quote, and it goes right with what you're saying. This is a quote from Tom from the Coast of Utopia. A child's purpose is to be a child. Nature doesn't disdain what lives only for a day. It pours the whole of itself into each moment. Life's bounty is in its flow. Later is too late. It is only we humans who want to own the future, too.
Well, you know, this brings up something, if I may use a psychoanalytic term here, how regressive most of these utopias are. I'm talking about positive ones. You know, return to childhood is more or less a given. That's where it all began. All that stuff about the innocence of children, which Freud has a few things to say about after all. I would say it's a very important reason why nowadays we're very worried about utopians and about justice.
And what utopians are we worried about?
But
What utopians are we worried about?
anyone with a program that requires close membership and agreement 100%. It's a very nice, well, not so very nice statement by German revolutionaries in 1918, which I can give you in either language, but in English, if you don't want to be my brother, I'm going to break your neck.
Okay. The question that is next on my list is this very exact thing. Margaret Atwood, again, I keep quoting her, but says in the magazine, as Nathaniel Hawthorne pointed out, the first two things the Puritans built were a prison and a scaffold. So what about the people who don't want to join or who don't fit in?
But that's, I mean, one of the key ideas of any kind of community is the idea of the rules and the sort of the boundary and the rules of this of whatever it is that you're suggesting. And I think, I mean, going back to the threat of nudity, I mean, I think that the idea, the reason why it's interesting is because there are all the rules of social behavior and how you dress or not, or how you behave or not. And I think that the thing that I felt was what has always been interesting to me about utopian thought, I mean, I include as a modern utopian like Buckminster Fuller and Daniel Bell and people who wrote about a possible way to integrate production and communication and society such that the idea of growth was the idea of having access to the benefits of human experience was dispersed as much as possible, allowing for as much growth and both individual and community growth. And I think that the interesting thing about utopian, one model of utopian is that it's boundless, you know, with the spread of resources and access and potential. And the other is the bounded model of utopian, which was about it'll be us, we'll do fine, you know, and everyone else, well, you know, that's their problem. Mm-hmm. And I think I think that one of the modern problems, which certainly something like Second Life and other things suggest, is the idea of a boundary is now impossible. You know, kind of a bounded, an idea of utopian as a bounded environment is not possible. It's always, all the models have to be interdependent, and that's very troublesome. And I think that that's one of the ideas that Stoppart's actually exploring in this in this play. Mm-hmm.
Because I think some of the utopian thinking, I don't know about the philosophers, but I mean, you think of George Sand, it does embrace sexuality. In other words, it isn't pushing that away and returning to childhood. It is finding yourself through, you know.
Well, it came in various forms. I mean, Natalie Hertzen in Stoppart's play, we assume, at least I assume, perhaps salaciously, that she had physical relations with, what's her name?
Natalie.
The one you call Natasha?
Yeah, Natasha.
It's called Natalie in
everyone
history.
in this play was named Natalie.
They got terrified that there'd be too many Natalies, so they changed the second Natalie to Natasha. But in any event, the two Natalies / first Natalie and Natasha have some kind of relationship. I assume it to be carnal, but she doesn't want to think of it in that way. She only thinks of it in terms of the higher universal romantic spirit, which this intense relationship, the most intense of her life thus far, has allowed her to join in. But it has nothing to do with eroticism or jealousy or possessiveness. It's just love. So even though for some, say Wagner, it certainly had an erotic component. For others, it did not, or at least did not consciously. They repressed the notion of eroticism.
But some notion of this fantasy, this intrapsychic fantasy, can be represented in a regressive return to childhood, but the deepest fantasy is harmony, is a reunification of what had been separated. It's a very old theme, both literature and philosophy, and in these characters in the 19th century, most dramatically expressed by the poet Hölderlin, that every aspect of speech and consciousness is a separation or disuniting, that poetry especially can give us intimations of a kind of, by harmony we mean also a harmony with the natural elements of human life, that especially in the modern scientific world, the conception of nature makes the idea of embodied mindedness, embodied eros of a human form, it's such extremely difficult even to comprehend, much less to experience. So people like Schiller thought in sensual objects like art and in sensual experiences like aesthetic experience, there wasn't the great dualism between sort of conscious control and natural necessity, that there was some harmonious transcendent experience in which we had an intimation of the harmony prelapsarian or whatever, but not necessarily one that's just childhood, but a reintegration, harmonious life, because for many of these thinkers, the deepest characterization of modern life is Zerrissenheit, torn apartness.
Well, you know, obviously Wagner and his theories of the 1840s, from which he later lapsed, but also Nietzsche, before he split with Wagner, articulated a theory that carried this notion of anti-Zerrissenheit to a full unification of the arts and a looking back to an idealized Greek situation in which the politics, the sociology, and the art were all supposedly unified, and from which everything had fallen apart and needed to be pulled together, preferably by Richard Wagner.
Yeah, well, people are very afraid about this, and the German people after the Second World War kept looking for where did it all come from, the dark side of the German tradition. Right. And this hunger for a natural, harmonious unity, an experience of oneness, was characterized as the great failing, that the English and French Enlightenment were much more secular and less ambitious and perfectly willing to tolerate various aspects of division as long as everybody got fed and wealth was distributed and that, things were working relatively sanely. But the Germans apparently had this aspiration that a lot of these philosophers, it resonates with the Russians, for a much deeper kind of harmony. And without that, without the experience of it, the material success of the Enlightenment would be useless.
And that is surely the position that Stoppard takes at the end of this trilogy, which is that ultimately, despite the notion that we must go on and so forth in Herzen, that the notion of this utopian quest is destructive. Yeah. And that Stoppard, is advocating what I, in my little article there, argue is a kind of liberal British gentleman's view of what a rational, limited, reasonable, perhaps not so exciting or thrilling or deep, but humane society should be, which in turn leads to the question as to whether or not we are witnessing a return of utopian thought today.
Okay. Anybody want to address that?
I just want to add one little thing about art, if I may, that goes back to this painting, because it's not for naught that this painting is so closely associated with play. And this was, we talk about destruction and revolutionizing what people thought about in terms of the nude. I mean, this was, to bring you back to your question about nudity, this was a naked woman. This was not a nude woman. And Manet's Olympia, of course, was a profoundly naked woman who was referring to Titian's Venus of Urbino, who was a profoundly nude woman. So this was a inherent in this one painting is a whole play on, no pun intended, on this question of what is naked and what is nude, and shocking people into rethinking the position of the human body, the role of the human body in this question of utopia, because it was really now that the naked body was being shown for the first time. Up till now, we had the Greek ideal, we had the representation of the nude in countless paintings and sculptures. So it's very interesting from the aesthetic point of view and from the question of the nude body that all of this is kind of coming together in this one painting. And I think he's very deliberately and smartly using that as a way of reinforcing this sense of shock and dislocation of tradition, visually speaking, as well as in terms of the philosophical
most
context.
painters didn't paint like Monet, and the Olympia would have been just as good as an illustration. But one way in which you could do it was to give them names, right?
Pardon me?
You give the nudes names. They are the season, they are later in the century, electricity, whatever. As long as you have some explanation that make them like statues, they could be as naked as possible. There was the way in which it went and kept on going. I mean, I don't think there was a school of Monet.
Right. But we knew who she
Progressive
was.
painters liked him, but did not paint like him. And I would argue that the 19th century nude is interesting in part because of all the explanations that are given and make it permissible. You know, the famous Greek slave is an example.
Yeah.
As long as you have a sad expression and a good name like a Greek slave who's about to be turned over to the Turks, you can do it.
Yeah.
If Powers had called that statue my girlfriend, it wouldn't have been exhibited, right? So he didn't. He called it something refined. Was this really true for
Birth of Venus.
hundreds of
The Birth of
So
Venus.
the whole nude
Yeah, the
naked
whole-
business is just a history of euphemisms?
It's also the context in which the body is placed, because
But the nudity in the play is exactly, it plays that same role.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
he actually recreates the painting on
Yeah.
the stage. And so,
it's the shock of seeing her in that context that
Yeah.
is so
Yeah.
that makes the point so clear.
And they're visiting Montmorency, which is where Rousseau lived.
Right.
I mean, there's just so much stuff that just passes through. It's like, whoa, Rousseau. Yeah. Did you have a comment?
Yes, this question of refusing to attempt to create heaven on earth in terms of utopia. I mean, people like Marx hated utopia and criticized all these different utopians, the different varieties of utopians in the 1840s, because he knew it wouldn't go anywhere. And utopia is the great, he called three great utopians, Owen, Fourier, and Saint-Simon. Even they are not going to be able to go too far, because the problem why it arose was because the working class was arriving. Suddenly there was a new class that was developing. Okay, so how did he go about it? He created capital. Now, capital is not a utopian piece. It's an analysis of how capitalism works, whether you agree with it or not. It's the law of motion of society, of capitalist society. Lenin did not create some kind of utopian. He said, well, how are we going to do this? So everybody thought he was crazy. Said, well, we're going to create a newspaper, and around that newspaper, we're going to develop people who can think, and we're going to develop the skeleton around which people are going to get to know each other and bring this thing around. And he did succeed up to a certain point. So they weren't utopians, and then they also knew that at some point that they didn't have all the answers, and that others would stand on their shoulders. You know, but utopianism, I mean, Hegel, who said anything that's real is rational, that was not true. And, you know, which is where Marx so disagreed with him. You know, Marx thought he was so great.
Yeah, but all Marx said was, not yet.
Yeah, right. Well, here's this
That's utopian thinking.
Definition which says that utopia is that which does not exist. But with dialectics, of course it does not exist.
Isn't it
because
Marx
everything changes. Nothing stays the same.
Yeah, and that's the official.
Shut up, but I mean, you know, utopia.
I just a brief disagreement. I think Marx was a utopian. He believed, I mean, you have to be utopian to believe in the rationality of history. I mean, it's in a way a kind of, I mean, he had his own explanation. He believed human beings were just anthropologically so constituted that they would always seek to produce the maximum amount of goods with the minimum amount of labor.
Without his theories, it never would have happened, all those things that did happen.
Well, I agree with you that he was against moral utopian, sort of dreamy moral demand kind of thinking. But there's something incredibly utopian in believing that history, which Herzen finally says, is really like the weather. It's a perfect sort of counter-Marxian
Never know what it's
statement.
going to do.
And let's not forget materialism.
But
Also
Marx
very
is-
utopian.
Yes, but Marx. One of the reasons why Marx was a utopian, I think, is because he was eminently projectable. Almost anybody could think that their ideas were Marxian because they said certain words or certain things. And I think that everyone who heard it could think about how they could optimize the world from their own perspective, and it could be socialistic or Marxist. So I think that the thing that was great about him was that he created an incredible model which anybody could adapt and claim to be true to form, which was a very smart way of writing a utopia. I mean, a lot of the other utopians were much too narrow in the definition, too precise. So I think one of the things about utopian writing is the ability for everybody to think that they're already doing it. That makes it really utopian.
Yes, sir.
I was just thinking in connection with this colloquy that, as I understand it, Karl Mannheim sort of, if I understood, said that what you get in the modern era is a conjunction of what he thought of as utopianism, which is a kind of Chiliastic fervor, a kind of a feeling of imminence, that reality is going to take over. And it's timeless in a way. And he sees that as, I think, coming from Bassism, conjoined with ideology, which is a plan that the intellectuals have that moves into the future for accomplishing something. And that when these two things come together, you have the transcendent, almost mystical energy of discovery, sort of combined with a kind of planful management, which is the ideology, which eventually freezes over the energies and becomes a bureaucratic, and he was thinking obviously of the Stalinist and Nazi phenomenon. But I think he felt that it really, what we generally think of as utopianism, or sometimes think of it in politics, really was a combination of kind of the Jim Jones phenomenon and the Lenin phenomenon of planning, that without one, the other, it wouldn't take over. And that it was self-limited because the ideology would eventually had to be practical, was a plan for the future, and would eventually regiment the inspirational sources of the utopianism that you found, for example, with early religions, Bohemia and so on. So,
Anybody want to? Okay, yeah.
I haven't seen the play, but I was a little surprised that Stopper didn't engage with the reaction against Utopia, which of course was very strong in the voice of Dostoevsky in the 1860s. And I was interested in, I think it's
Mr. Pippin
talked about what was common to utopian movements was this gesture and longing for a reunification. Well, in the reaction against Utopia, which certainly was central in the character of Raskolnikov, who wrote against the Chernyshevsky novel What's to Be Done, you have a character who also longs for a certain kind of reunification, joining up with the movement of bonding with the earth. I can't remember what it was called in Russian, but there was a movement of, the great Russian soul, a part of it was reuniting with the earth. It was very connected with Russian Orthodoxy and Christian, but there was this pure reunification for the anti-utopian. So I just wonder how unique that character is.
Well, yeah, Chernyshevsky is actually a character in the play, but you're bringing up an interesting question, which is, we haven't talked about at all, which is the religion. And is the
But
search...
this 1860s reaction is dealt with in part 3.
Well, I mean, it's Chernyshevsky is Chernyshevsky, yes. No,
Some have read it.
4 performances I've seen it, but he's only brought in a somewhat tangential way in the play. But this question of yearning for a different world is expressed in religion, and these are characters who don't follow that route. I mean, they're using philosophy, political thinking, And Dostoevsky, of course, is a much more, Christian writer or religious-based writer. And we haven't even talked about religion, except for to mention Jim Jones, as I did at the beginning.
American religious utopian communities.
And the utopian communities, yes.
Talked about the kibbutz either.
And the kibbutz, yes.
Okay. Just a little pendant there. In Crime and Punishment, it's not so much the Christian gesture, which comes later in Brothers K, but the effects of being enthralled to a utopian ideology. What happens is that Raskolnikov pushes to the logical conclusions of being hostage to this utopian ideology of the earlier 1860s, 1850s.
Schlossberg's point of view seems to be more like Tolstoy than anyone else. He's born deep, sort of grave skepticism about the attempt by human beings to control historical fate. It doesn't catastrophe. If actually we attempt to do it, we end up mucking things up a lot worse than they would have been if we left it alone. So it's a very Tolstoyan sensibility. But the point you're making, that there was not just a counter-utopian, but a vast counter-enlightenment reaction from very early on, and certainly, say, in someone like Burke, this notion that there are forms of associated sensibility that are not rational, that are pre-rational, and that we abandon or distrust at our peril, continues all the way on through the 19th century and assumes some very dangerous forms. I mean, we talked a little bit before about fascism as a form of utopian thinking, but it is true that this odd fact that at just the moment when bourgeois civilization was beginning to pay off its promissory notes with, greater health, security, sanitation, production of wealth, liberal democratic institutions, at just that moment, the best minds in the Western European culture turned against it, either wanting to accelerate out of it very rapidly, as in the Marxist ideology, or to go back to what had been lost, blood and soil, and a form of communal association that wasn't based on rational self-interest. So there's a curious kind of dynamic also psychologically in this form of self-dissatisfaction at the moment when its actual promises were beginning to be paid off. We have this trajectory out of it, either dystopian or utopian, or however you want to characterize it.
Mm-hmm. Stoppard is disapproving of these people, but he's also very affectionate about them.
That's right. It's not a moralistic.
That's the subject of his play.
That's a good point.
And especially when you bring in the aesthetic and the romantic, as you pointed out, he humanizes them in a way that
very much
is a nice gloss on Carr and Berlin.
And I think that tension is the tension of using art to tell that story, and I think that there's he has a certain ambivalence about telling the story well in a play rather than telling that story well in life. I think that there's it seems to me constantly fighting the fact that it's actually only the theater in which this is being said, which is really interesting to me. I thought it was like, it's always like, it's sort of okay to be saying it at a play, but plays are sort of fake, and it's
and
really
it's also
interesting.
Fascinating. It's obviously researchable, but fascinating to figure out which lines are Stoppard's and which he's more or less lifted from Herzen, especially
I think there's
Herzen.
Unfortunately going to be a piece in the book review about that very subject soon.
Oh yeah, why unfortunate?
Oh, I don't know. We had an unhappy article in the Times and a happy article in the Times about this. An unhappy article by a gentleman who said you had to read 19 books to be able to see the play, which was just idiotic. No, that's Mr. Grimes. It was so difficult to understand that you had to, and Tom had to write a letter to the editor saying only an insane person would require its audience to read 19 books before you see it. We tried to invite him to come see the play, and he wouldn't come, so he's never seen the play. But he is now reviewing Herzen's, the reissuing of My Life and Thoughts, to answer this very question: what is Stoppard and what is Herzen?
Oh, so it's an article with an axe to grind.
Well, we hope not, but no. But we also had a second really wonderful article in which our production has made Isaiah Berlin's book "Russian Thinkers" be put back on press, and
you can't buy it in New York.
It's great. I know. I think we made, just in production, we made buying books for the actors. We made The Romantic Exiles, like number 500 and something on the Amazon bestseller. Why this run on the book? But evidently, Isaiah Berlin's widow is still alive, because the man quoted in the article from Oxford, Henry Hardy, called, and she's in hospital, and she would be so cheered to know that her husband's book is going back on press.
Could you get him to mention my book?
Is the Herzen autobiography unexpurgated?
It's great.
I know, but the point is that the version that's been out was edited by MacDonald.
Dwight MacDonald, yeah. It's like 4 volumes, and he only includes about half of it, or a little less than half.
And so the reprint is also of his edited version?
I think so, yeah.
Too bad.
Yeah. Yes. I'm calling on everyone from this side of the room, but yeah.
I was thinking, you guys brought up art, and I was just thinking that what I know about More and Plato, I'm thinking about More was so indebted to Plato, he came up with the word utopia. So
yes, Thomas More coined the word, right?
Feels so important here. Neither of them really knew what to do with artists. I didn't even know that about the musicians in Plato. I don't remember it, but I know with More there was like this conflict about what to do. Certainly there was an island that was utopia, and everybody who didn't really want to play the game was off it. And there was a lot of problems with everybody who was artistic or had different ideas and who had different this, and you had to believe in a God. You could have different religions, but all that fascism that comes at the beginning of utopia. And then the relationship with art, which I think you've been trying to get at.
Well, Plato, of course. I don't know what to say about that. I'm just the person working on the show. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
It makes me think of Woody Allen's line about I wouldn't join any club that would have me as a member.
Is that Woody Allen well, that was Mark. Groucho
that was Marx who said that.
It was Groucho Marx who said that.
Well, maybe. Sorry,
they both wouldn't be in the same club.
Okay, so that idea is the idea of the artist, which is that you can't be a member of a utopian community if you're really an artist, because you're struggling against the environment in which you're living.
But there are visions of utopia that are artistically based or that include art
of course.
as well.
But
with all due respect to Plato as the
vision.
Well, it reflects a deeper problem in political philosophy that isn't really easy to deal with. I mean, most political philosophers, if you press them, will concede that people generally, not philosophers, but people, don't have allegiance to political doctrines as a result of being persuaded by rational arguments. That's not how the world works, and most intelligent philosophers realize that. That means that what the real subject matter of political thought is something like political psychology, the way in which the economy of the soul works in a certain way to create allegiances. That makes poets very controversial, very problematic, because they have a way of creating erotic attachment, approbation, disgust, an enormous number of very powerful human passions, better than anybody else. And so that suggests 2 problems, that utopias are almost necessarily anti-democratic. I mean, the classical forms of utopias, because if you're going to have a utopia, you have to have some system of political reform. And as we've just been admitting, political reform is ultimately only effective if it's psychological reform. And that means manipulating people's psyches. And we don't like that. I mean, it's just, there's an inherent, we shouldn't like it. There's an inherent sort of problem with who gets to determine how the psyches get changed. But the problem with artists is they just get permission to do that. I mean, that's what they do, is change human psyches in various ways. And so if you're a real political reformer and you're being quite serious about it, and you realize you don't have this naivete about the force of argument, then your major competitor are going to be, let's say in general, poets.
Yeah.
Because they know how to do that better than anybody. And they're very dangerous for that reason.
Is there a certain self-abnegation that exists in the ideal utopia? I mean, that would make the artist or poet instead of the contrary that we see. I mean, I wanted to ask you more about these communities, the communities online. Because there's a certain, there's a famous sociological book called Community and Society, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. turnus, in which you discriminate between the desire for community and the desire for society. And does this world like Second Life, is this an aspiration to, I mean, to go against what I earlier said about the individual and the intrapsychic issue? Is there an aspiration, that is reflected today in these online worlds for a sense of community? It's both self-invention and self-abnegation. You join, you don't really have a name, you're an avatar or whatever.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is I think it's actually iterative. It's both. Because I think you sort of join to see what you can design or create, and then you want to see what the reaction is to what you do and what kind of community you can build around the things you do, or what kind of community you can create by how your joining of other communities will work. And the interesting thing is just like all sort of dynamic systems, there are small pockets of where people are coming together, and then there are pockets where people are going apart. And it's constantly that process of people cycling around someone who's interesting or some area that's interesting, and then going apart and going to other areas, just as any dynamic system works.
So it existentially kind of monitoring of this process. It has
right.
kind of.
Well, the thing that's so cool about it is that it's dynamic. And so we have all been living in this world where we had to assume static models of anything in order to appreciate them, because there was nothing where we could see things moving except real life, and it's very hard to model in real life. So that's why these things, I think, have a potential for people really being able to study and see what the consequences of actions are in a way that has never been possible before.
Was it you who brought up the notion of bounded versus unbounded? I mean, do unbounded utopias exist before the World Wide Web?
Probably not. I mean, what would you think?
I would think not, but
yeah.
And are they unbounded because they literally have taken the notion of utopia and introduce an element of freedom, or are they only unbounded because there is an essential disconnect between the virtual world and the carbon world, as you put it?
Right. But I think part of it is about the idea of scale, and that it's like Upanishads, don't think of anything lest your head fall too big, lest your head fall off. It's like if you think you start to go too far out on an idea, it falls apart in your hand. So I think that any model starts to be bounded. I mean, that's the history of science, which is bounded systems, and so you can understand them. So I think that there are always these small systems, and then you see them in slightly larger ones. But the idea is that it is the fascinating thing, if you ever explore these worlds, is that they are conceptually boundless. I mean, if you want to start to build your community at the perceived edge, there's plenty of room.
Sort of like visions of America in the early 19th century.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, except really boundless. Yes.
A very interesting range of things that are coming onto this table. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just want to put a devil's advocate question. And what we've been talking about is that the primary barriers of utopian, anti-democratic on the right, on the left, so we get fascism and Marxist experiment, as well as the number of religious communities. And the presumption being that there's this sort of top-down model, which is opposed to a more piecemeal model of social engineering along the lines of what we find in liberal democracy. So the contrast, it seems to me that the contrast that's been set up is between liberal democracy and everything else around it. But after 1989, right, after the collapse of Soviet communism, you get a feeling that the major ideological competition to liberal democracy has failed. And so some people went so far as to proclaim that Francis Fukuyama was famously right, that we have in fact reached an end of history, and that end of history is this liberal democracy which is inherently pluralistic and self-governing, chooses its leaders and protects the rights of minorities and so forth. However, and then there was also talk about ideology, and I would guess that everyone in this room probably agrees essentially that a liberal democratic model is the best and is the best form of governance, and all we have that compete with it are reactionary movements. So we can't really get better. All we have is to lose this sort of liberal democracy we have. The question being, haven't we now achieved, or isn't the ideology that we have in fact achieved a utopia here? And so isn't the evidence hurt by utopian thinking, and as evidenced by the fact that I would presume that no one here disagrees with it? Wrong way of Marxism. I mean, so
you could be resigned to something without thinking to that. I think what's happened is, given there being, for one thing, what's happened is the whole realm of politics, the boundaries, let's say, of politics have begun to erode. That is, the classical 18th, 19th century model of the nation state has become less and less relevant to the world of global capitalism, for one thing. There's a lot of things one could say about the proper subject matter of politics has changed. So part of the liberal democratic revolutionary ideology has just become irrelevant. Not so much affirmed or resigned to, or it's just ceasing to be the discourse in which the most important issues of the control of power are discussed. So that has a parallel in the rise in academic culture of cultural politics. If you had to identify what's the greatest Western utopian ideal today, it has something to do with what philosophers very abstractly talk about as the other. That is, a way of thinking about the boundaries between groups, races, genders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, such that what seems like the perennial, psychologically unavoidable origins of hate, exclusion, groupthink, and so forth can be addressed. Nobody seems to know exactly how to do that. Goes back to the issue of political psychology again. But there is a utopian aspiration in the West. Doesn't really have to do very much anymore with the control of state power, because there isn't that much. The state power as classically understood in the formation of liberal democratic political philosophy in the 18th century.
Got to think about all this, okay? Yes.
You mentioned science fiction, and I mean, in the Times today or yesterday, Alessandra Stanley had a review of Lost, or a discussion of Lost, in which she essentially mentioned all these television programs that deal with extraterrestrials and mystical other worlds and parallel universes and whatever, and sort of neatly summed them up as a pure example of the decline of the West. But the fact is that there is a lot of interest in that, and people are fascinated. I mean, quite apart from the many people who've been abducted by spaceships, there is a kind of bubbling under, as we say in Billboard magazine, a fascination with things that directly refute the liberal democratic idea. Now, whether they will coalesce eventually into totalitarian forms of bounded utopianism, I don't know, but the urge persists.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention those when you were, leaving cyberspace to just go from high to low or whatever, into all of these, lost programs, or leaving society, and then it becomes very. I don't really watch them much, but it becomes very. Very gloomy. Everybody's always trying to do the other one in. They're not particularly idealistic or utopian, but yet they all seem to want to go there.
The interesting thing is that no one seems to, well, not no one, but people don't, when all these social communities, these net communities, MySpace and Facebook and all these things start to emerge. They're not unlike the CB world 25 years ago, or every one of these worlds that exist. Everyone invents a language. They start to identify themselves. They go through the exact same thing that any culture develops in terms of primitive behaviors and then somewhat sophisticated ones and a variety of other things. And we tend to think that if it's carried by a sophisticated medium, it'll have a sophisticated quality to it, and it does not. It has actually very primitive, what's your name, where do you come from, where's the police, what's the problem, all those issues become the same conversation.
What's your favorite album?
Right, but the interesting thing is that you can actually watch the generation of a culture by watching how people start to behave on these new in these new communities.
You would know more about this than I, but isn't there an anti-utopian buildup of thought amongst people who think hard about the web? I'm thinking of Jaron Lanier's attack on Wikipedia and all that.
Yeah.
I don't know where you stand on that, but it is interesting that even within the world of unbounded utopias, there are cautionary voices now being raised.
Right. Well, I think it's really interesting. If you started to look at the Oxford English Dictionary when it was first put together, before people had a chance to edit it, there were millions of mistakes in it.
Right.
You know, Wikipedia emerges, there are lots of mistakes in it. It's terrible. Suddenly, because it's
But is that his argument, or is his argument?
His argument is that you have basically that's a dysfunctional model to think that people would actually ever want to increase the level of sophistication and accuracy of information on the web. That there would always be an incentive for people to, as my son did last week, you know, put complete nonsense on an entry just because he thought it would be fun, which people do constantly on this thing. Well, so that's an interesting aspect. Instead of thinking about that everything that we put in anywhere in the world has to be the truth and perfect, if you think of it as an experiment in social relationships, at a certain point in time, people develop the techniques which allow you to behave better. That's what happens. And so Wikipedia has a model. It sort of works sometimes. It's better than, it's a very interesting way of composing the agreements between people about what words mean.
God, this is like a philosophical argument from the 19th century, isn't it?
Definitely.
Tom Stopper's next play.
Then Christopher Fuller wrote Utopia or Oblivion.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, but every one of the utopias that's sort of single author utopias are always bounded models of how it could work best for me in my head. I mean, they are, or typically they have been, anyways. And his was it was very interesting, but it was all about making sure that everyone had the right amount of food, clothing, and shelter worldwide. That was baseline condition.
Oh, this is also interesting. Yes?
This is just a point of clarification. I may have missed something. But I wanted to know the context in which you said that the boundlessness of these communities on the web, that this utopia is dangerous as opposed to bounded.
I said, I don't think it's dangerous. Yeah, well, I mean, these are experimental situations. You know, supposedly there's something like 25 to 35,000 people who become parts of these communities, these massive multiplayer games in these communities a day. You know, there are, I don't know, 250,000 more URLs every day. People are constantly becoming part of this world all over the place. And it's fantastically interesting.
Is there any relation? Has anybody looked at any relationship between participation in that world and participation in the carbon world?
Well,
is it becoming a real substitute?
Yeah. Well, for a lot of people, some large number, mostly men between the ages of 18 and 30, it can be 40 hours a week. American men, and supposedly in Korea, it's high. I don't think there are any really good statistics because no one's really collecting them well yet. But it is intense, really intense.
You could propose marriage, get rejected.
Yeah.
Your business can fail. Yeah. Your colleagues can sue you.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are starting to be lawyers who exist only in these environments. So that's really scary.
I have to ask whether or not people acknowledge that there's a big problem with this, especially for people who are assigning research papers to their students, because they all go on this Wikipedia and they cite it as though it's absolutely carved in stone.
Right. I think that people, the idea of people making mistakes and getting the wrong information is always a cultural problem, and it's a different kind of way of correcting it.
It's also a question of accountability, because these things aren't signed. So one of the things we teach our students is, find a good source, and how do you trust your sources?
But this is like year 4 of the invention of this world, and that it would get it right at year 4. The expectation of that is insane.
It's also not been accepted by the other world. I mean, I'm part of an organization that recently applied for a grant to a foundation that was out to build communities. And so the application was to build a virtual community. It was rejected as irrelevant to the criterion of the foundation, because the foundation was thinking about, people in towns or in neighborhoods.
Right. Well, I'm thinking, I don't know, this conversation is so wide-ranging now. I mean, I'm thinking about the cover of New York Magazine this week about cyberspace. Did you see this? This sort of, can you describe it better than I can, this sort of sexy teenager?
It's about people
disclosing everything about their private lives online, because not only because of the anonymity that it affords them, but also because of the ability to disclose everything.
And it says, is this horrifying and and breach of privacy, or is it, according to the girl, freedom?
Well, all those things. I mean, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
I think something you said before is extremely important too. There's no reason to expect that all of the traditional human problems with being human won't simply get replicated. It's not going to get worse. It's not going to get better. It's just going to be the same thing we've always had.
Right.
People will manipulate other people. They'll be incautious about what they do. They'll start lying. They'll feel sorry they did this. There'll be a reaction. It's the same old, just magnified a billion times.
And faster.
And faster.
That's bigger. Right. Yeah. Well, again, Russia, the world that Stoppard was modeling, a world of 60 million people or 70 million people, of which 1 million or 1.5 million were actually capable of carrying on an independent life. And now 6 billion, almost 6.5 billion people. It's different. 2 more people a second. It's a different world. So utopian is very different.
Well, I mean, the last question I haven't brought up, and it seems like we've gone everywhere, is where is the utopian thinking in the world today? In religion, different parts of the world, and social organization, politics. Where on the web? Where is it?
Everywhere.
Does anyone see it?
It probably will always have readers and writers, but I would think it's got such a bad reputation that I don't see too much future for it. I mean, considering whether it's Pol Pot or anyone else you'd like to name, people who, if you don't want to be my brother, you will not survive. This is, in a way, has become a kind of mantra for a great many people. Maybe not 100% right, but with some good justice. I want to come back, since we have an architect here. It seems to me architecture is particularly well placed in knowing what utopian thinking can do, because some of them get built. Right. And I was thinking of my favorite horror of the 20th century being Le Corbusier. All you have to do is to go to La Défense and say, is this what we really want? And I think the answer would be no.
Yeah, well, if you look at Brasilia, if you go to Brasilia, which was a utopian government, or Albany, Chandigarh, all these places that were designed as basically solutions to an entire new village and a new way of being. They always fail terribly.
Well, not always, but Chicago burned down in 1870. Some people did some good work.
Yeah, but idiosyncratically, never as a master plan.
Well, there was Burnham, actually. There was a kind of master plan. They had this genius idea, very expensive, to keep 18 miles of the lakeshore undeveloped. Yeah. And that was part of the whole new thinking about
that's not building.
Right, exactly right.
Always not building is a good idea.
That's right. That's utopian thinking.
That's utopian thinking.
That was actually based on Swedenborg. Swedenborg's utopian view of the world. So.
Yeah. Well, architectural, which is that German town that's still so perfectly replicating the 18th century? Is it Karlsruhe or one of those
it's not that.
Sort of minor duchies in Germany? It has a perfect grid plan. Sort of like Washington, D.C., except better. What? Manhattan. Yeah, the
I don't think Karlsruhe. I used to live in.
Well, it's one of those. I don't know who, but one of these West German sort of duchies was laid out by its ruler in the late 18th century with sort of perfect symmetry, and it still exists. If you look at the Stadtplan of the Innenstadt, it's right there. Yeah. There's plenty of examples of those kinds of things that precede 20th century architects.
But I think the way Frank Gehry is changing urban architecture is utopian and good. You can't imagine the difference it makes to Chicago. I don't know if you've ever seen the new band shell in the major park of Chicago. It changes the entire city.
But that works. I think the Avery stuff does work.
Yes, what I'm saying, that there are
Bill
examples.
Bau's even more dramatic because,
it's quite
Bill Bau is
utopian.
absolutely incredible, yes.
The LA Center, too, is a departure from conventional architecture in a radical way, with a utopian view of how it might change whole communities.
But it's not a city plan. It's an inspirational building.
Well, he's getting so much work lately that it is.
World plan.
Yeah. That's when it gets dangerous.
I've been struck by how one theme has been that this has been a dialogue or dialectic that's gone on for maybe 3,000 years or so. It comes and goes, utopian thinking. But when one thinks of 3,000 years of time is not really that much time in the history of the Earth, and I'm struck that no one has mentioned the supposed threat of global warming and how that might influence thinking today about the future and what is the future, and is this an unspoken, at least here, an unspoken theme that is underwater, so to speak.
But it's really interesting because one of the problems of sort of utopian ideas is that there's an opportunity to revert to an earlier state of the ecosystem, which is clearly not possible. So then, what is the state that you want to make an effort to sustain? And that conversation, people have been resisting that conversation in almost every quarter of the sort of scientific and educational and ecological communities dramatically. But that's the big conversation, which is do we know enough to make a decision as to what we'd like, what's the base case that we all like to live under? That's a utopian problem.
And, you mentioned the religion. Max Weber had a famous dichotomy between the church and the sect, and going against the architectural model, which is more permanence. It seems impulse in religions. One is really the temporal component to utopianism. That is to say, it's something. Is utopianism a flash in the pan, but then under institutionalization, or like the Philoctetes Center came around, and we started off with a discrepancy with this kind of unmitigated kind of psychoanalytical, intellectual psychoanalysis. So there was no control over it. There was no moderator. There was no themes. We just would get really interesting people that would come together, and it was really quite fascinating. Not for the audience, but and then it became more institutionalized. Over the period of 3 years, it's changed from the initial kind of. And is there something about utopianism that has always existed kind of in a certain way as a kind of a process?
I don't. Someone, when I went to Japan, someone said that I should go to see the oldest temple in Japan, and I went to see it, and what it was a temple that had been rebuilt every 22 years for the last 1,000 years, and the community, the parish of the church. Their whole religious practice was to rebuild this temple every 22 years, and they grew the trees, and they did every of the things, and that was their religion, to build this building again and again.
Where is that in Japan?
Well, I'll get the reference to it, but it's near Kyushu. It's very small, but that's the story, and it's the oldest temple in Japan. So in a sense, it's the idea of the temple that's been sustained over 1,400 years.
It's the Issei Jingu, it's the shrine, it's the imperial shrine that was rebuilt over and over and over again. How many years was it?
Well, in this,
20 years or something like that.
22 years.
That's, and therefore preserves. It's sort of like in a way, a metaphor for the way you think of memory these days.
Yes.
That it's sort of, instead of staying permanent, it's continually rebuilt. That's what its permanence is.
Right.
That's the Issei Jingu.
It's the law of development and regression, either one or the other.
That's life.
I have my back to the side of the room. Anybody have anything to say over here? I've sort of turned my head.
I wanted to ask back about something, if some of the panel would want to comment. You made a very provocative, for me, distinction between naked and nude. And if I understood you, the idea of the nude was a kind of idealized or glorified image, and the naked figure was a more realistic or tangible figure, and therefore somehow more dangerous or somehow more provocative. I wonder if you could speak about the function of the female form in the context of, is one functioning in a more utopian way and one in a more realistic way, or something like
And
that.
does it apply to the male form as well?
What?
Does it apply to the male form?
How would it apply to the male form?
Well, I mean, David or whatever.
Well, in that painting, the figure is a known model, so, and everybody knew in the community who she was, Victorine Munier, so they knew she was, they could identify who she was, and that was an unusual thing for the time, and the way she's represented is clearly out of the tradition of representing the nude female body. She's represented in a much harsher light, as though she'd been photographed. So it's the mode of representation is new for the time, and the fact that the nude is identified and brought out of that ideal realm, these are two shocks to the system, and I think that's why the painting is still so powerful, and that's why it seemed to be so appropriate for this context of discussing, kind of fragmentation of utopia. And that tradition had been so powerful for so many years that to do what he did was not only an artistic statement but a kind of political statement also. So.
And what did that? What were some of the ramifications of that startling shift in terms of the representation of the female form or the depiction of nudity or nakedness in art?
Well, it had to do also with the way in which people thought of space as a form in which they could represent nature, because this was also about a shock to vision, a question of engaging the viewer in a new way. She's, after all, looking out directly at us and participating both in her pictorial space and in our pictorial space. So there's another layer there of shocking. The nude continued to be represented, but the repercussions of that painting were, I think, more about how we saw the world around us and how we engaged with art in general. So all of the many revolutions from then on, I mean, you could even talk later about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon as a kind of harshness in terms of not only pictorial space, but how the nude was treated. So there was, a series of sort of ricochets from then on in terms of how artists dealt with the nude. And this was just one of the most shocking ones of the time. And the first, I think, to challenge that whole hegemony of the nude figure. So,
I think of Greek statues, nude or naked. I mean, I think they're nude. It's got to do with the origins of, Christianity and all that. And the nude is Adam and Eve before God chooses them out. For me, then they become naked. And I don't think it's
Okay. Any other? Yes.
I wonder if some might comment more on the psychic dimensions of Utopia. It seems to me that when someone was commenting on Stoppard's ambivalence toward these characters, that's really the anti-utopian framework part and so on, because isn't utopian ideas also a way of eliminating ambivalence, eliminating the biological demands of the body, of the psyche, and that in a certain way, even the appeal of something like the silicon world is also an elimination of the biological destiny.
Doris Lessing wrote a semi-autobiographical novel recently called The Sweetest Dream, which was, if you want to reduce it to the basics, communism. And but it was the kind of utopian idealism of her youth and of the 60s, and how it had not panned out quite as they had hoped. And I think that Stoppard's treatment of all of this is sort of that it was a sweet dream. That as I said, that obviously he's critical of the utopians, especially as they evolved into the harder-edged versions in the 1860s, Marx and others that we meet in the part 3, but also just the general, anticipating the 20th century and all of that. And yet, he has this affection not only for the characters, but for the ideals that they had in their personal lives, in their artistic lives, and in their political lives.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would agree. I mean, if I would speak for him, no one can do that. I mean, I think what he took from Isaiah Berlin when he met Isaiah Berlin was an admiration for people of very different talents and personalities. Turgenev, Bakunin, Herzen, and I mean, these are very, very different people with different ways of approaching and making change, who in the course of this unbelievable century of all the things that happened to them in their public lives and in their personal lives, remained friends, remained able to talk to each other, disagree with each other, as opposed to the new men who come along and, when those disagreements arrive, banish anyone who doesn't agree with them. And it's that ability to stay flexible and to continue to create and change as they get older that he admires. And I think he took that from Berlin. And whether that's ambivalence or whether that's admiration,
well, I'm also referring to the intrapsychic world where living with incommensurable wishes and inevitable conflicts that is part of our biological heritage is something that, utopian fantasy is also, it's not just a fantasy of reunion, it's also a wish to escape from the incommensurable dimensions of human life.
So Stoppard would, in that sense, be not the correct view, but there's something about the aesthetic capacity to maintain the tension that is intolerable for philosophers, for example, or for rationalists or something like that, that only can happen. I mean, Almodovar made a movie about a man who rapes a comatose woman, and you're full of sympathy for the man. Yeah. It's a remarkable manipulation of point of view as a technical matter, but it's also another indication that the judgmental, qualifying, philosophical categorization impulse can be defeated if the work of art is a great enough work of art. And I mean, it would be the wrong question to ask to say, well, what does that tell us about how we should live? Because that would destroy exactly the achievement.
Yeah, I mean, and that actually comes around to another thing which I hadn't thought to mention, but it's something we discussed, and it's in the magazine, which is, we haven't talked much about Belinsky, Vissarion Belinsky, who I knew nothing about until I started working on this project, but he was a literary critic who said, if Russia is ever going to be created as a culture, it will be created by its writers, by its literature. And he encouraged Dostoevsky, encouraged Turgenev, he encouraged Gogol. And the creation, we have a piece in the magazine about the creation of a national identity. Is the identity of being American created by American writers? Is it, creation of English identity by Shakespeare? Creation of and that's the Andy O'Hagan piece. So is the larger notion created by artists? Perhaps for those reasons. Yeah. That's also an issue in this trilogy, among other thousands of things.
I think you're making the point really that in art, things are possible that are not possible within one's own life. And that's what makes art so compelling for most of us.
But it's not, right, fantasy. It's not like an escapist possibility that you can't have. It's actually an intimation of a desideratum or something that we can't give up, that we have to keep alive somehow. And art keeps it alive, even if it doesn't give us a blueprint for how to realize it.
And extend art into virtual reality, and you sync up those two, as alternate. I mean, this is why I perhaps rudely, slightly bridled at your notion of late 19th century art as an escape from reality, because there are other realities, and they are in dialogue with or a conversation with one another all the time. That's why, for me, the Stoppard play, balancing, as you put it, politics, religion, and art, or romance and art, is so fascinating, that he isn't choosing sides and seeing the romantic and artistic sides as somehow, it's like in newspapers, hard news, which is real, and soft news, which is secondary. That's not the way it is on the coast of Utopia, which is, to me, a more accurate reflection of life than the hard news, soft news dichotomy.
Yeah, and he's very sympathetic to Turgenev, who's always being accosted by people in the play who say, what is your point of view about the Russian peasant? And he says, it's all the points of view about the Russian peasant. He's not good at answering questions about what the coast of Utopia is about. He said, I'm writing a play and I have to think about my characters, and I don't know, I mean, or it's about this and that. I mean, it's not a question you can ask an artist, really.
Even ask some artists, they'll talk your head off, but other artists.
You can ask.
This has been a really amazingly interesting discussion. And I also think it's interesting that Rob's question, which raises the issue of psychoanalysis and Freud, is sort of given short shrift in a meeting that takes place on 82nd Street, where the beginning of psychoanalysis took place in America, and was the zenith in the first half of the 20th century. And in this building, he's like not mentioned.
What about Herbert Marcuse's efforts to marry, especially early Marx, with Schiller and notions of sort of play and so forth as the utopian goal of a revolutionary process?
I think that people are just wanting to escape from what Dr. Penzer was the reality of the psyche that people just don't want to deal with. And I don't think our culture wants to deal with it. And in some ways, I think our conference hasn't really dealt with it.
Well, I may only have to apologize because I'm here because of Frank, but I know virtually nothing about psychoanalysis, and I've never been in psycho, so maybe I didn't ask the right questions. I'm sorry.
It does sound a bit like the voice of the Freudian superego.
Yes.
Over your shoulder, behind you.
Perfect location.
Yes.
This gentleman with the beard mentioned that art is not synonymous with reality. I believe that's what you said. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I was picking up on the idea that art is a medium through which people's fantasy lives can be sort of expressed and appreciated, and by both the artist and by the person who's the audience of the artist.
But my question to you is why...
That doesn't mean that art isn't real. I'm not saying art isn't real, but I think it has to be juxtaposed against, I guess, what we would call the reality principle, to use a psychoanalytic term.
Yes.
May I probe a little further? Do I have your permission, or would you rather I didn't? No, because you aroused my curiosity.
That's not actually the subject of this round.
I understand.
Okay.
I understand.
And this gentleman...
Since the question of psychoanalysis came up, I would think most analysts in the room would be thinking all along of the parallels of psychoanalysis, because the contrast between the utopianism of the psychoanalytic tradition and other currents that came is such a dramatic one for any analyst, any historian or analyst themselves, because historically and as well as contemporaneously, it sort of fought out. But originally, there was a very strong, not with Freud, but with many of the people that gathered around him, there was a very strong utopianism. Even before Marcuse, many people joined the Freudian movement because of a kind of sexual utopianism that they had in mind. Many of the original converts. And in the early days, the idea of, for example, prophylactic psychoanalysis, I remember hearing an account by Marianne Eckert Horney. Marianne Horney Eckert, our married name is Eckert, who was Karen Horney's daughter, who had been sent with her sister to Melanie Klein as a child for what was not uncommon there as a prophylactic psychoanalysis that would take care of, prevent them from becoming ill. And this current sort of balanced against Freud's kind of skeptical sense of the limitations of humanity, then got played out a little bit in the sense of European versus American psychoanalysis, where the American had this, a kind of, had a tendency to use the analytic mission or tradition or promise in a somewhat utopian fashion, with a feeling that it was boundless, that material conditions, biological conditions, quite contrary to what Freud thought, would not pose any kind of barrier if you could improve the social surroundings than if the person were completely analyzed, etc. So it's just, and I'm sure, one of the variables in the warfare that goes on within analysis between things like self-psychology, which are felt by their opponents to be a kind of perfectibility theory of how people can commune. It isn't, that's selling it short, but the feelings are still there. That there's one side which would be more literally utopian in what can be accomplished in analytic treatment, and the other one being more, what would be the opposite of utopia? Sort of
Dystopia. Dystopic. Dystopic, that's the word they say.
It's hard to be a therapist and be dystopic. But it would be more
pragmatic.
Pessimistic. Almost pessimistic.
All right, we have time for one more question. Is that what you're telling me? Anybody? I feel like I'm ignoring this side of the room, but maybe I'm not. Anybody have any?
We can't have utopia unless we teach everyone to use their goodness, to live in goodness. Because if you have badness still operating at the same time, you'll never get to utopia. For me, utopia is absolute freedom to do what I like, but I know the right things to do. We don't know that yet, do we?
It's a line from our play. Is freedom my ability? How's it go? Is freedom the fact that I can sing in my shower as loudly as I want without disturbing my neighbor singing in his shower?
Good soundproofing is not utopia.
All right. Thank you very much.